The Trump administration deports hundreds of alleged gang members to El Salvador despite a judicial order saying it cannot, while some Republicans begin to call for the impeachment of judges who are blocking Trump actions. Welcome to Potomac Watch, the daily podcast, the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal. I'm Kim Strassel, and I am here today with my two colleagues, Alicia Finley and Bill McGurn. President Trump on Friday invoked the Alien Enemies Act to deport nearly 300 alleged members of Venezuelan and Salvadoran gangs. After the planes had left on Saturday, a federal judge, James Boasberg, verbally directed in a hearing that the government turn the planes around and then issued a written order. The administration did not return the planes. They made their argument for why in a Monday hearing that got pretty testy, with the judge rebuking them. But the Trump move looks to be very much in keeping with a promise Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem made in a recent Department of Homeland Security ad.
President Trump has a clear message for those that are in our country illegally. Leave now. If you don't, we will find you and we will deport you. You will never return. For too long, weak politicians left our borders wide open. They flooded our communities with drugs, human trafficking, and violent criminals. They put American lives at risk. Well, those days are over. If you leave now, you may have an opportunity to return and enjoy our freedom and live the American dream. But understand this. Under President Trump, America's borders are closed to lawbreakers. Follow the law, and you'll find opportunity. Break it, and you'll find consequences.
Let's go through this, Alicia. And by the way, I'm glad to see you have not been deported, nor Bill, at least not yet. But let's dive into this. And why don't you start us off with an explanation of the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, a law that has been used during the War of 1812 and both World Wars, but has not been used since World War II. What's in it that allows the president to do this? And what was Trump's justification for using it in this case?
So, as you point out, this Alien Enemies Act was passed in the immediate aftermath of the founding, when there was a lot of tension between the Federalists and the Republicans, and especially regarding ties with France. And so, what this law allows the president to do is, whenever there is a quote unquote declared war between the United States and any foreign nation or government, or any invasion or predatory incursion shall be perpetrated, attempted, or threatened against the territory of the United States by any foreign nation or government, and the President of the United States shall make public proclamation of the event. All natives, basically, of the hostile nation or government shall be within the U.S. And not actually naturalized, liable to be apprehended and removed as alien enemies. Now, I read through the entire law because there's some tension and disagreement over whether Trump has the power to do what he's doing. And in this, what he's basically saying, he's actually issued a proclamation that has said that these criminal gangs are arms of the Venezuelan government, and this is an incursion perpetrated by actually the Venezuelan government and Maduro. Therefore, he has the authority to remove anyone who is part of these gangs. And by the way, he's also deemed them terrorist organizations. He's able to remove them without any of the normal due process rights that would accord to other illegal immigrants who are in the United States, including a hearing in an immigration court.
So, Bill, when I listen to Alicia say that, it seems to me that there's little question that this is a very expansive statute, one that gives the president really quite sweeping powers. And Trump is probably, in sort of any normal course of things, would be allowed to do this kind of deportation. Although it strikes me one other big tension in this is that supposedly we are meant to be at war for this to be invoked. And there are now a bunch of disputes about whether or not, does that have to be a formal declaration by Congress? Is that something that Trump can simply say on his own? What is your read of this?
Well, first of all, I could be wrong in this. My understanding is that not all those deported were deported under the Alien and Sedition Law. a lot of them, as I understand, had final deportation orders, which are generally issued by an immigration judge. So some of it is routine. The difference is, I think, the Trump cited the new authority, or actually it's very old authority, but he's the first one to cite it since I think World War II, because it helps him expedite deportations. And before I think you're right that it's very expansive. It hinges on whether we're at war and who gets to declare that. Um, I think, like with all these things going on, there are two questions that tend to get conflated. The first one is what the courts will eventually sort out. Does Donald Trump, as president and head of the executive branch, have the right to do these things? And I think in of all these cases being litigated, in more instances than not, the Supreme Court will ultimately find that he does. Then there's a second question, is it the right thing to do? Even if you have this, I tend to think Trump's vulnerability on this is more political than legal. In other words, if he deports some really innocent person, not innocent in terms of being illegal, but not a violent gang member, just, someone working and peacefully and abiding by things, and something horrible happens to them, I think there could be blowback on that. Um, but in the meantime, the question is going to be, on who has the right to decide where the state of war. I mean, Congress declares war, but we certainly had conflicts without declarations of war. So it's gonna tangle up the courts for some time. And this is only one of many issues, like this, that all come down to, does the president have the authority he says he does?
Bill just brought up something that I think is a really interesting central question here that's getting some attention, growing attention now that people are focused on this case, and that is whether or not there might be some mistaken identity in here as well too. This is just a curious question. The Trump administration really has not released much, if any, information at all about the individuals on these planes, nor has it provided any evidence, as it were, that they were members of one of these gangs. There were two in question, Tren de Ragua and also MS-13. Um, and I think one of the interesting things here is we now have got some stories coming out from family members of some of the individuals that were sent to El Salvador, saying that their family members are not members of gangs, that they were incorrectly scooped up. And now they're off in this, this quite horrid El Salvadoran prison, which everyone agrees is really a nasty place to be. And what is the way of fixing that problem, if there is any? Alicia, Bill was talking about the politics of this. Is that is that something that the administration is a mistake not being more transparent about who this is applying to and why they are applying it?
Well, I think this is actually part of the design is they're being purposefully ambiguous. If you listen to the Christy Nome ad earlier, they want to send a message: "Don't come here. You could be deported for any reason at any time." And here they're essentially sending these, young men. And as you pointed out, there is some dispute over whether some were actually involved in the gang. But under this Alien Enemies Act, the president could essentially deem anyone to be involved. They have a friend or such, and there really isn't any due process to contend or to argue against that. So I think the intent of this is to send the message that, to quote unquote self deport. Now, on the politics, Donald Trump's immigration policies is actually where he's polling strongest right now. He has a majority support on actually a lot of his hardline immigration positions. And insofar, I think there is a lot of public support for deporting members of these gangs. There's no question about that. But the question is, once you start to get press anecdotes about people who were caught up or ensnared in this, innocent, young men, teenagers perhaps, that were deported to these work camps and forced to suffer some of these put inhumane conditions for crimes that they never committed, the public could actually there could be a public backlash on this, and I think that could actually undermine support for President Trump's other deportation or other border policies.
Let's turn to the argument with this judge. The timeline here is this: the president signed this order invoking the Alien Enemies Act on Friday and formally announced his move on Saturday. The ACLU and Democracy Forward, a liberal activist group, on Saturday morning quickly filed a lawsuit on behalf of 5 of the Venezuelan men. The flights on Saturday evening began to leave, and then there was a hearing in front of James Boasberg, an Obama appointee who verbally directed the government to turn the planes around. About 40 minutes later, he posted an order online, but it didn't contain that direction to return the planes. The administration then landed them and handed over these individuals. And in a Monday hearing, the administration made a couple of arguments that essentially the verbal order didn't really carry weight and the written order didn't carry an instruction to return, and that moreover, once those planes were in international airspace, the judge didn't have any authority. He obviously disagrees. Bill, who has the better argument here? Sort this out for me.
Yeah, I wish I could. It's very confusing. I think the judge was a little sloppy, not including that language in the
Yeah.
written order. I also think the judge may be overreaching. We'll have to see what the appeal courts and I think ultimately the Supreme Court rules. It reminds me of the travel ban. There were all these judges that came out and ruled against the administration. Then it got to the Supreme Court and it was upheld. And I think what we have now, in addition to the fight over the issue of deportation, there's a fight brewing over the use of judicial power to usurp presidential power. That's how the Trump people would argue. And it'll be interesting to see how that turns. I think there's no question. If you look at the temporary restraining orders they've issued and so forth, there's just an enormous number of them about Donald Trump, and I think he's going to again. I think he'll prevail in a lot of those cases. A lot, as I say, comes down to this is a tough question. Who decides whether we're at war? And it's going to be the president. That's how the Constitution lies it. Now, on details on some of it, maybe they'll lose. It'll be modified. I don't think he'll get across the board wins. But I think at the end of this, we'll have clarified a lot of the separation of powers. Alicia brought up, I think, Clarence Thomas's concern about the judicial orders and so forth, that one judge somewhere can stop the president from doing something all across the nation. I think that it is ripe for a decision by the Supreme Court. I think they're going to have a hard time ignoring it.
Alicia, talk about that a little bit because this issue of injunctions, obviously, there are different levels of this, right? Okay, there are temporary restraining orders, which are meant to be in place for short periods of time until you have a hearing. There are temporary injunctions, there are permanent injunctions, there are universal injunctions, ones that extend beyond the particular jurisdiction in theory of the judge. It is in general correct to say, is it not, that the use of these has grown significantly in the 21st century. Definitely, if you go back through the United States, they were relatively rare. What is your view of the amount that are being issued at the moment in response to Donald Trump? Now, look, there's a lot of litigation. I should also hasten to say that there are a lot of judges that have actually refused to issue temporary restraining orders or injunctions, but there are a handful of judges, more than a handful, that have been handing them out right and left, in some cases going so far as to order the administration to take certain actions. For instance, the judge who recently ordered the administration to pay out certain funds to contractors. Is this becoming a problem among the judiciary?
I think it's a major problem, and you saw that going back to the first Trump administration, which when it really started to come to a head when you had Democratic AGs and other liberal groups sue in friendly jurisdictions like the Ninth Circuit, where you have a lot of liberal judges, as well as the DC Circuit. You get judges like James Boasberg, who actually issued a number of essentially universal injunctions and overreaching injunctions that tied or went beyond the specific plaintiffs in the case to block a policy in general. So usually, when you have an injunction, or historically, what has happened is the courts will decide the quote unquote case and controversy before them, which is usually between a defendant and a particular plaintiff. And if there's, for instance, a government action that oh, it affects a particular plaintiff, it will enjoin it as to that plaintiff, but not over across the entire country and across all potentially other affected parties. But
Right.
you saw that increasingly happen in the Trump administration, where, for instance, California would sue to block a Trump administration policy, or a left-wing group would sue to block a policy immigration, for instance, for Maine and Mexico. That was a major one. And a judge would issue a universal injunction blocking it across in all states. And of course, Texas was very supportive of Trump's policies, but nonetheless, the same injunction applied to Texas. Now, what you actually saw, Clarence Thomas did opine in an opinion to one of his decisions that maybe judges are going too far. Neil Gorsuch has also adopted that position that judges should not be issuing in universal injunctions, because that actually prevents different district courts from hearing cases, and maybe they come to a different conclusion, and then these cases will eventually percolate up to the Supreme Court, whereas kind of one district judge could essentially tie the hands of another district judge when you have a universal injunction. And so it became a problem. But you also saw it during the Biden administration. You saw some conservative judges issue national or universal injunctions, but you also saw some actually pull that back. Case in point was, the Clean Water Act rule that the Biden administration imposed, and you had a number of Republican states sue to challenge that rule. And it was blocked within the conservative states that had sued to challenge it, but it was allowed to go into effect in the other states. And so I think some of the conservative judges have actually taken the cue from Claire or from Justice Thomas and narrowed the injunctions, but liberal judges clearly haven't, and you're now seeing them order the release of funds, essentially through an injunction blocking President Trump from essentially reviewing uh, Biden administration spending policies and how they decide to distribute money, for instance, under this greenhouse gas reduction fund, or otherwise known as the Green Bank. And you have essentially judges and plaintiffs asking for uh, a judge to provide blanket relief to anyone, even if they aren't party to a case. And I think that that's not exactly what the framers intended when they set up the judiciary.
Well, this overreach by judges has certainly gotten Republicans' attention. Um, in the case regarding the Venezuelans who were deported, Trump unloaded on the judge on Truth Social, specifically writing, quote, "This judge, like many of the crooked judges I am forced to appear before, should be impeached," with many exclamation points after that, end quote. And that joins calls by members of Congress and Elon Musk for judicial impeachments. Bill, this inspired Chief Justice John Roberts today on Tuesday to do something that he rarely does. He issued his own statement in response, noting, quote, "For more than 2 centuries, it has been established that impeachment is not an appropriate response to disagreement concerning a judicial decision. The normal appellate review process exists for that purpose," end quote. And, I have to agree with that. I am with Alicia that there is some abuse that we are seeing among the judiciary with the use of injunctions and in other ways that it is throwing its weight around, arguably in a way that judges shouldn't or don't have, that they shouldn't be doing it. So they're over flouting their judicial muscle right now to a certain degree. But that being said, I don't know that, I mean, impeachment is not necessarily the way to deal with this, because you're essentially going to weaponize and that process. And I'm a little surprised at some Republicans that are so quickly turning to this. We just spent 4 years dealing with lawfare and dealing with extra ordinary circumstances. But prior to that, 2 impeachments of Donald Trump. And obviously, things need to be calmed down, go back through the orderly process. It would strike me that one way to do that would be to allow the Supreme Court to take up some of these issues and send some guidance to these lower court justices about the best way to handle stuff. But that to immediately go to the impeachment route really escalates. What says you?
Well, generally, you're absolutely right. This is a consequence of the lawfare we've been seeing for years. You mentioned the impeachments of Trump. There's so much going on, and this is a backlash. Now, Trump people are in power, and they're getting even. So they're responding to abuse with the dubious proposition. I think John Roberts was right, but people feel frustrated by the kind of abuses you want. In general, though, I'd have to say the founders expected this. They expected each branch of government to jealously guard its own rights and probably try to encroach on the rights of the other branches, but the other branches would resist. Ironically, they expected the least practitioner of that to be the judicial branch. They thought it'd be more reserved. So I think we're going to have this until the courts start um, reining these judges in and giving some guidance on the thing that keeps us really free, the separation of powers. But calling for the impeachment of judges, the requirements are pretty high. As I understand it, I think it needs 2/3 of the Senate. When did we ever get 2/3 of the Senate to agree on something? So it's kind of, it's kind of a name calling. It won't have any effect. It's not a real threat. They're not going to be impeached. Um, so I await, as you say, the further guidance. And to Alicia's point, I think Clarence Thomas was prophetic in calling for the court to resolve this kind of issue. Because whenever you have like a policy that Trump announced, some judge somewhere is going to block it.
Yeah, and I would note that watch this space, because the Trump administration just recently filed a brief entirely focused on this question, requesting the Supreme Court please handle this question of injunctions, and put out some guidance to lower courts. It has to do with a very specific case that they're dealing with on birthright citizenship, but the brief was focused on asking the court to finally resolve some questions on injunctions. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Alicia. I want to thank our listeners. We are here every day. If you like the show, please hit the subscribe button. And if you'd like to get in touch, you can at pwpodcast@wsj.com.